Welcome, I'm Jonathan Hudson, and this is Deep Dive featuring Hudson Institute. And in today's edition, we're going to focus on three main topics. The first one is going to be about the Gaza Strip. A fragile ceasefire is still somewhat surviving all complexities. Nonetheless, it is in a very dire state, and fighting might resume very soon. The Islamic Republic of Iran is drawing near to breakout of its nuclear weapons capabilities, and program is in very advanced stages. On that, we will discuss at length the contents also of the latest reports by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and last but not least, the latest developments in Syria with specific focus on the southern parts of Syria, what is currently taking place there. A number of clashes were reported, and of course, there are ramifications for Israel's security. Let's now turn first to introduce our panelists for today, namely Dr. Mike Duran, who is a senior fellow and the director of the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East at Hudson Institute, formerly the senior director at the National Security Council for the Middle East and North Africa in Washington, D.C., of course. Next to him, Mr. David Albright, who is the founding president of the Institute for Science and International Security. And last but not least is retired Colonel Dr. Eran Lerman, who formerly served as the Deputy National Security Advisor here in Israel, currently the Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. And I'd like to start with you, Dr. Duran. If you may focus on the Gaza Strip, where are we currently in this whole conundrum?
Well, thanks. Good morning, Jonathan. It seems like we're now seeing, I think, pretty clearly the effects of the Donald Trump's policy on the dynamics in Gaza. Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, has proposed a new framework for extending what stage one of the multi-stage hostage for prisoners deal. According to this, Hamas would free up front half of all of the hostages living and deceased. And then the second half, they would free the rest of the hostages. This is the new Witkoff framework. The Israelis have accepted this framework, and Hamas, to my understanding, as of right now, has rejected it. In response, the Israelis are ramping up the pressure by denying humanitarian shipments into Gaza, but also threatening that if the framework is not accepted, that they will resume military operations in Gaza, and they will resume them at a level that we haven't seen before. So the making good on Donald Trump's promise that all hell would break loose. So bottom line, we see greater pressure from Israel in support of this new Witkoff framework, and we're waiting for Hamas to come back with some kind of response.
Dr. Duran, before we move to Dr. Lerman to hear the Israeli angle to this, I'd like to ask you particularly, tomorrow is going to be a summit of the Arab League and Islamic Council to be able to discuss the so-called day after the war in the Gaza Strip, which does not converge with President Donald Trump's own day after proposal. What are we to expect from that summit, and to what degree is that going to frustrate Washington's own approach?
The president has a vision for Gaza that he put out, but there's been no clear American plan about how to realize that vision. And we see in the Arab world people organizing, I would say, against it. Basically, the idea of transferring population out of Gaza to other countries. In order for us to get to the point where President Trump's vision is being implemented, we have to have a few things on the ground. Number one, we have to have an end to Hamas as the governing institution in Gaza. That means all of the aid shipments that come through Gaza and go through Hamas for distribution have to be taken away from it. There have to be safe zones where Gazans can raise their hand and say to the Israelis, you know what, I would like to go live in Albania or Mauritania or wherever some alternative place for them has been identified. And of course, those places have to be identified. The United States, I don't think Israel can do that alone. The United States has to find countries that are willing to stand up to the pressure coming from the League of Arab States and others not to do this. So none of that kind of infrastructure is in place. So right now it's a lot of, I think, people staking out positions, but we don't have a concrete plan either way about how to take care of the day after. There won't be a day after at all until Hamas is defeated. I think that's the most important thing to realize.
Absolutely. A lot of rhetoric, not much substance when we're talking about that. But Dr. Lehman, I'd like to ask you as to Israel's perspective. The 42 days of phase one have come and gone. Since then, Israel has tried to reach some sort of an extension to phase one. Where is Israel currently in that context? And to what degree can we be optimistic about the special envoy of President Trump, namely Steve Witkoff, coming to the region in a week from today and resolving the matter in all the current complexities at hand?
Well, there was very little in recent weeks that gave Israelis reason for optimism. The sheer barbarity, the ghoulish displays of Hamas fake triumphalism in the releases of hostages, and particularly the release of the bodies of the Beaver's children, have left Israelis, I would say, with something that reminds me of Scott Fitzgerald's famous observation about the ability to hold two contradictory concepts. I don't know if we rate as great minds, as he suggested, but we do hold two contradictory propositions in our heads. One, that as Michael said properly, Hamas must be destroyed. You know, old Cato, Hamas delenda est. It cannot be allowed to be the governing force in Gaza, looking down the road, not only because of us, but also because this would signify to much of the rest of the region, much of the rest of the world, if you wish, a victory for the most murderous type of terrorism. Moreover, there is deep rooted anger in Israeli society across the board. Even the leader of the Israeli Zionist left said, well, we need to deal with the hostages, but then we will deal with Hamas. We will eradicate Hamas. So that's one aspect. At the same time, there's also very strong support for completing the hostage deal as best we can. And even if we have to make promises to Hamas about a permanent ceasefire or something, some form of language that goes beyond that, in order to get all of them back, that's not out of the question within the variation of some sort of the Witkoff framework. And then we would feel, I think, quite frankly, free to make our own choices on the famous concept of not on pacta sunt servanda. We don't have to be bound by a treaty extorted from us by threats to the lives of our citizens, but rather of rebus sic stantibus. Things stood that way, but they will no longer be that way down the road when the hostages are back. Problem is, Hamas understand, in Hamas they also understand it, and therefore their willingness or motivation to cut a deal, knowing that Israeli anger will persist, is very limited. And the key here now is in the hands of the two negotiating players, the Egyptians and the Qataris, the mediators. to what an extent they will understand the need for them vis-a-vis Washington to work within the Witkoff framework and basically force it on Hamas. And they do have leverage. They do have very significant leverage. Which brings me to your other question about the Arab League. I think the essence of what they're trying to do is basically to signal to Washington that they understood that Hamas must be removed from power in Gaza. But they differ on how to do it, and the summit has been postponed more than once because of these profound differences. And I believe that while the Egyptians and to some extent, and of course the key Gulf players, the Saudis, the Emiratis, hate Hamas with some venom, the Emiratis and the Saudis and the Egyptians hate them with some venom. The Qataris have a different take, and all of this makes the deliberations of the Arab League rather inconclusive. Ultimately, we would need an Arab element involved in Gaza in the future, but it cannot be exclusively Arab. Whatever happens in Gaza would first of all require the IDF to crush Hamas, and then for some kind of international framework to replace Israeli governance.
Thank you, Dr. Lerman. Let's shift gears to the Iranian nuclear file. On that, Mr. Albright, I'd like to ask you particularly, two reports have come out by the International Atomic Energy Agency. The IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi has spoken earlier today on the contents of his report, or two reports in response to various questions by journalists. But nonetheless, your institute does focus on this quite intently, and I'd like to hear your take on the substance of those two reports, which I have studied and I found quite bleak, to say it mildly.
Yeah, and I think the first point to make is that we should not lose sight of this. It's not openly discussed in the reports, but Iran is its nuclear weaponization program, the part that builds the nuclear weapon itself, is making progress, and there is no international eyes on that program, and so we don't know how much it's shrunk the time frames between a decision to build a bomb and having one. We don't fully know where it's taking place. And so I think that's the first thing. In the reports itself, the reports are much more quantitative and much more black and white. I mean, Iran in this last period, which covers about 3 months, has dramatically accelerated its production of 60% enriched uranium, which is just a hair's breadth away from weapon-grade uranium. And in essence, what it's doing is it's taking its 20% stockpile and burning through it pretty rapidly. And in essence, they're in a breakout stepwise process. They're going that next step from 20% to 60%. They can't sustain this rate, but it's still, they're making quite a bit of 60%. In fact, if they did decide they wanted to go to weapon grade uranium, within about 3 weeks, just at Fordow, they could produce enough weapon-grade uranium for 7 nuclear weapons. And so they have a tremendous capability at Fordow now to make weapon-grade uranium in large quantities. It could actually also start from natural uranium and make weapon-grade uranium if they so chose, at a slower rate, obviously, but nonetheless, Fordow is now a nuclear weapons-capable site that goes way beyond what the Iranians originally dreamed for this site in the early 2000s when they made the decision to build it. On other issues, the IA reports that they're at an impasse on the whole question of what about the undeclared nuclear materials at these various sites. I mean, that gets right to the questions about the past nuclear weapons effort. And so you have a situation where Iran doesn't even bother to address or pretend to address the IA's concerns. It's just literally stalled out and with no resolution in sight. And so this puts a tremendous pressure on the board. And one of the things that I know we're looking for at my institute, and I know others are, is that it's time to snap back the sanctions under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. I mean, the whole process ends in October of this year, and it takes some time to do it, to snap back. And so it's time that this take place, and that and at the same time, it's more important than ever that and I would say the Board of Governors needs to weigh in on this, but certainly Western powers, that any movement by Iran toward building nuclear weapons, or even reaching a state where you have almost zero confidence or less confidence in what they're doing, will lead to a harsh military strike. And that I do think Iran can be deterred from crossing the line, but we have to be very careful that we don't read this report with all the progress in being able to make weapon grade uranium quickly as a sign that we should give up. I've already heard those kind of voices. It's too late. They're too close. But in fact, if the world is prepared to strike militarily, there is time to do that. And I think this report just adds urgency to prepare oneself that a strike may be necessary to pull off relatively quickly, and in a way to deter Iran from actually succeeding in building a nuclear weapon.
Into context, a necessity to prepare various contingencies of what may occur following such a strike in the Iranian context and the regional context at that. But Dr. Duran, I'd like to hear your take on this, just to point out that on the one hand, the Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, came out and stated that he was in favor of negotiating with the United States. Nevertheless, once Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic, announced a decree that basically barred Iran from negotiating with the Americans, he then had to align himself with the supreme leader. The Majlis or the Iranian parliament just announced that it voted no confidence in the Minister of Economy, who was now ousted, and the Goebbels of Iran, namely Mohammad Javad Zarif, the Minister of Strategic Affairs, has resigned at the recommendation of the High Islamic Council because of fears that Western elements may pressure him, and by doing so would then also pressure the Iranian establishment.
My impression, it's very hard to read these all of these different signals, Jonathan, but my impression is that the American policy, the new Trump administration's policy, has given the Iranians a little bit of breathing room, because President Trump has signaled, on the one hand, that he wants to return to maximum pressure economic sanctions against Iran, but he also wants a negotiation, not unlike the kind of pressure that the kind of position that he's taken with respect to Ukraine, where he has positioned himself as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine, between Putin and Zelensky. He's, I think, a little bit more in the case of the Israeli-Iranian contest. He's a little bit more on the side of Israel than he is as a mediator between Israel and Tehran. I think that's pretty clear. But he has not green-lighted an Israeli military attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. I think that was the desired position of Prime Minister Netanyahu when President Trump was inaugurated, and the signals we're seeing. It looks like President Trump has said, let's hold off on any kind of military action right now. Let's see if we can get a negotiation going with the Iranians, a negotiation from a position of strength after the sanctions are put on. And the Iranian response to that is, no, we don't do business that way. But of course, they can say that Ali Khamenei can take that position because he knows that the Americans are restraining the Israelis. So we're kind of in a holding pattern for the moment. That's how I see it. And the growing, I don't know what to call this relationship between Putin and Trump, détente, a Russian Israeli, a Russian American détente, or easing of tensions. That's also, I think, easing the tensions on Iran somewhat.
Indeed. Dr. Lerman, you have 1.5 minutes on this topic, so keep it short, please.
So clearly, there's turmoil in the Iranian system. I think the key here is the pressure, the economic pressure, and the growing unrest. However, we don't have time for this to mature. The ticking clock is the one that we've just heard described in terms of the enrichment program. We have weeks, maybe a few months, for one more attempt to get them to the table. But if Khamenei's position is adamant, we are down the road to a direct confrontation.
Mr. Albright, very briefly on this as well. In layman's terms, what is the window of opportunity for a strike?
I think it is within a few months. I mean, the unknown is how much progress are they making on building the nuclear weapon itself, and also are they putting together a secret enrichment plant where they may do some things we're not even aware of, and it could be like a black swan event, and where they get nuclear weapons. So I do think that the time is very short, and if Iran doesn't show some real commitment to major concessions and transparency. I mean, the IA has to be able to do its job. We need to know what's going on. But if that doesn't happen, I think it probably will be a confrontation between Israel and Iran. And I hope my country supports what Israel will do.
Let's shift gears to the Syrian file. We don't have very much time left for that, but nonetheless, Dr. Duran, I'd like to hear your take on the latest developments pertaining also to the clashes between Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is seeking to consolidate its power in Damascus, and the Druze community in South Israel, in South Syria, particularly in the southern Syrian neighborhood of Jaramana, where clashes were reported over the weekend that brought even Israel into the picture, where it said if HTS would attack, Israel would step in.
Yeah, there was some kind of clash in this suburb of Damascus, as you mentioned, this southeastern suburb of Jaramana, which is a predominantly Druze suburb. Exactly what the clash was is not clear to me, but the Israelis, in the form of a statement from the prime minister and the defense minister, took the opportunity to say that Israel was going to protect the Druze of Jaramana from HTS, from the ruling element in Syria today. This is in keeping with the policy announced a few weeks ago by Israel, where the entire corridor from Suwaida in the south, Suwaida is the main Druze area, up to Damascus is going to be in an Israeli let's say security zone, and with a special reference to the Druze. Of course, Israel has a Druze population itself inside Israel, which has been a part of the Israeli security system forever. And this alliance between the Israeli state and the Druze is very strong and very important to Israel. But it also, if we see it in a geostrategic context, it gives Israel something that it is missing in Syria, that is a ground game in Syria, particularly in the south, running all the way up to Damascus. Israel hollowed out the Syrian army and brought the Assad regime on the brink of collapse. But it was actually the Turks and their proxy HTS that came in and collapsed the Syrian government because the Turks have a ground game and the Israelis don't. So this signaling about the Druze is not simply about the Druze. This is also Jerusalem signaling to Ankara that we would like to come to some kind of agreement about our security interests and your security interests. Why don't we sit down on the table and talk about this? But so far, Ankara isn't talking to Jerusalem.
No, it's not. And just to point out, HTS was not the first one to enter Damascus. It was actually the Druze militias in Jaramana itself that confronted the 4th Division of the Assad regime, and subsequently also, of course, Ahmed el-Ode, who came with his own militias from Dar'a. But Dr. Lerman, I'd like again, 1.5 minutes, not more than that, unfortunately. What can you tell us about that, and how is Israel, in its proclaimed determination and forceful statements, going to ensure that its red lines are observed?
Clearly, of course, as Michael said, the sentimental and strategic and moral obligation to the Druze is part of what has been going on. And of course, the Druze population, the Golan, is by now much more aligned with its Israeli identity than ever before. And all of this is part of a very dramatic shift in the internal structure of the Syrian state. At the same time, it is not in Israel's interest to see the new regime in Damascus pushed into the arms of Ankara. And this explains to some extent the new feelers to Moscow and the fact that Netanyahu's ADC, General Goffman, went there just recently. We need to find channels to talk to all players in the Syrian game and create a new reality in which we do have as a game on the ground, but also some channels of communication to all players in Syria. The Syrian state is no longer in a position to be a threat to Israel, but its disintegration could threaten our interest, and the Iranians are still up to their old tricks, and we need to be very watchful.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I'd like to immediately thank Mr. Albright, Dr. Duran, and Dr. Lerman for all of your valuable insights. And I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. This has been Deep Dive featuring Hudson Institute. Until our next edition, from here in Jerusalem, wishing you a good day. TV7 Israel invites you to watch and hear some of the most knowledgeable experts, most of whom partook in creating policies shaping this region today. Join us for Jerusalem Studio.